Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our fourth podcast. We have Tanesha Williams here with us today, and we're looking forward to beginning our discussion. But first, I'm going to begin with the bio. Tanesha is the Counsel and Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Democratic National Committee, DNC. Before joining the DNC, Tanesha was a racial justice and voting rights attorney and digital campaign manager for the Prepare to Voting and Voting Rights Defender projects at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. There, she worked with partners in southern states to help fill the gaps left after the Shelby County v. Holder decision. After graduating from Georgetown University Law Center in 2018, where they were a public interest fellow, Tanesha worked as the director of organizing and community building for Families Against Mandatory Minimums, a criminal justice reform advocacy organization based in D.C. While attending law school, Tanesha clerked for the Poverty and Race Research Action Council, where she researched race and equity in education. Tanesha also was a Hawley Law Fellow with the National LGBTQ Task Force, where she researched and drafted criminal justice and economic policy. As a law student in Georgetown's Criminal Defense and Prisoner Advocacy Clinic, Tanesha represented clients before the Superior Court of the District of Columbia and taught legal research and writing classes for incarcerated persons. She was awarded the clinic's first Patsy Jarrett/Craig Muhammad Prisoner Advocacy Award. Tanesha also served as a managing editor of Georgetown Journal of Law and Modern Critical Race Perspectives. Tanesha is also the founder of Red Tree Strategies, a firm dedicated to helping organizations create more equity and inclusion. In this capacity, they work with national and global organizations, including leaders in education, nonprofit, and public policy and law. T, we're honored to have you on our board and for a podcast today. Thank you so much. And if okay with you, we're ready to jump into the first question.
Let's do it.
All right.
You.
Thank you. So since today is Juneteenth, it seems fitting to begin with a discussion about the importance of this federal holiday. What does this mean to you personally and more specifically as a leader in so many civil rights causes?
Yeah, well, first off, Mina, I'm always just super impressed by your work and what you've accomplished, especially at such a young age. So I am so grateful to be here with you today and to talk about all things civil rights and voting. And just a quick disclaimer, I am here in my personal capacity. I do work at the DNC, but just want to stress that what I say is coming from me personally, and it is not a representation of the Democratic National Committee. But let's jump in. I'm glad you started with Juneteenth. Happy Juneteenth, y'all. Juneteenth is also known as Freedom Day, which marks the day in 1865 when the last enslaved African Americans in Galveston, Texas were informed of their freedom. So this was more than 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. So this day holds like significance for me, both personally and as a leader that is so deeply invested in civil rights causes. Personally, it's a day of remembrance and reflection. Just reminds me of the resilience and the strength and tenacity of my ancestors who fought for their freedom so tirelessly. It's a day to honor their struggles and celebrate their victories. So acknowledging all the challenges that they overcame and the beautiful legacy that they left behind. It's just a really important reminder of the importance of freedom and the ongoing fight for justice and inclusion. And as a civil rights leader, I mean, it's all intertwined, but it also represents both a celebration and also a call to action. Like, let's celebrate all of the progress that we have made in this journey towards being a more racially equitable society. But there is so much work that still needs to be done to truly actualize that vision of being a more racially equitable society. So it's a day to remember that, you know, we're going to commemorate the end of American chattel slavery, but we also have to continue to address the systemic inequities that arose from that time in our history. And just a quick shout out, it's Juneteenth, so I got to shout out Opal Lee, who was the grandmother of Juneteenth and really advocated for us to have this day. All the Black folks in Texas who've been celebrating Juneteenth even before it was a federal holiday. And also got to acknowledge Biden and the Biden-Harris administration for signing the National Independence Day Act, which made this a federal holiday. So shout out.
Yeah, thank you for that. And kind of talking about carrying that legacy forward. For many students, this holiday occurs after the school year has concluded. So it's likely that it might not get the attention that it deserves. How would you recommend increasing awareness for this holiday among younger generations?
Yeah, that's a great question. As a former educator, I deeply believe in making sure that kids know our history and that it is embedded in our curriculum. And so I think it's a multifaceted approach. And you'll probably hear me say that throughout our time together, Maina. You know, most of these problems require comprehensive solutions. And so the first thing I would do is make sure that Juneteenth is incorporated into the curriculum. It is our history, and while there's legislation across the country that's trying to rip apart our history and truth. This is relevant in the broader context of American history and civil rights and of the concept and idea of freedom. And so, for sure, try to get in the curriculum. I know that takes a lot. So I also think that we can advocate for celebrating it before the school year is out. Most folks get out in June, and so looping this in into end of year celebrations. And I think the last thing is I believe deeply in meeting people where they are, and young folks are on social media. So how can we develop some social media campaigns that get information out about Juneteenth? Are there ways to partner with influencers or community and grassroots organizations just to really spread the message and make folks aware of what Juneteenth is and why we celebrate it as a federal holiday?
Thank you for that. Um, Switching gears a little bit to your current leadership position and at the DNC, but talking a little bit before then as well, beginning with your work at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and specifically working during a time of the aftermath of the Shelby County v. Holder decision. And just a quick background, but the Shelby County decision struck down a critical legal protection in the Voting Rights Act. And since then, we've seen an increase in gerrymandering of all kinds, both political and racial gerrymandering. So from your standpoint, having worked at the NAACP, being an advocate for minorities and committed to civil rights, and now at the DNC, what is your take on that kind of current legal landscape that we're in?
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, Maina, Shelby County Beholder was a significant setback for voting rights in the United States. What it essentially did was invalidate the pre-clearance requirement of the Voting Rights Act, which basically required states that had a history of discrimination to get any new changes in law scrutinized and approved before they were enacted. And so by removing that, we saw a floodgate of changes to voting laws. So everything from stricter voter ID laws to reductions in early voting, purges of voter rolls, and particularly in southern states, and particularly these decisions and changes impacted Black and brown voters. And so that with that little background, like my work and journey has allowed me to continue to see the importance of having a robust legal and advocacy efforts to protect voting rights. So the current legal landscape is marked by both significant challenges and opportunities. I really try to see both as we navigate the times that we're in. And so on one hand, we're witnessing an increase in voter suppression efforts, right? And it's not just in the South, but it's really across the country. These efforts are often couched in language of election integrity, but they have the impact of disenfranchising Black and brown voters across the country. On the other hand, there seems to be like this renewed national focus on voting rights, from grassroots movements to legislation. There's ongoing litigation that is challenging discriminatory practices, and some states are even implementing voting reforms that expand voting access. And so all of that to say that the legal landscape is very complex, it is very dynamic. And while we have to face the fact that there are significant threats to voting rights, we can also acknowledge that there are opportunities to advance equity and justice. And so, again, complex problems require comprehensive solutions. So we need the litigation, we need the advocacy, we need the grassroots organizing, and so much more to ensure that every eligible voter can participate in our democracy without facing undue burdens.
Yeah, and going from kind of voting rights kind of straight to the election, for many of us, it seems that the Supreme Court is so heavily imbalanced, and that doesn't seem to bode well for the protection of voting rights, of access to the ballot box and countless other ways. So from a political standpoint, and putting on maybe your DNC hat a little bit, what does this election mean for the composition of the Supreme Court, for the appointment of judges at all levels, and just race law in general?
Yeah. So I'm gonna say I'm not going to put on my DNC hat. I'll put on my personal hat, but I'll definitely give you the personal and political perspective here. I've had many conversations about this and really have thought about like the current composition of the Supreme Court. And it does raise significant concerns for the protection of voting rights, for access to the ballot, and for broader civil rights issues. And so the Supreme Court of the United States plays such a crucial role in interpreting the Constitution and shaping the legal landscape of the nation for years and generations to come, right? It's decisions related to voting rights, affirmative action, bodily autonomy, criminal justice, and other critical areas. They really do have these decade-long impacts. And so there's a heightened risk that the court may continue to roll back these protections that have been so essential in advancing civil rights and ensuring equal access to the ballot box. And so the election is pivotal. It is a crucial election, and it's for a variety of reasons, right? One being that the election will influence not only potential appointments to the Supreme Court, which is so important, but also appointments of federal judges at all levels, right? So the president and the Senate have the authority to nominate and confirm judges. And these appointments shape the judiciary, again, for generations. And so judges who are committed to upholding civil rights laws, who are protecting voting rights and ensuring equal justice under the law, they are crucial for advancing racial justice and equity. And so from a political standpoint, I've been telling folks in my conversations that, this election is like a game of chess, right? It's more than just about the immediate outcomes. It really is about the long-term direction of the country's legal and judicial framework. So that means whether or not we have laws that uphold the principles of equality and justice for decades, or laws that decimate those principles. Fundamentally, we have to have a legal system that works for everyone. And I think the second part of your question was around like race law.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so as someone who is committed to civil rights, and particularly the implications of civil rights for Black and Brown folks, I'm deeply concerned. Decisions that weaken protections against racial discrimination, that limit affirmative action, as we've seen, or that undermine voting rights can and do have a devastating impact on communities of color. So it is absolutely crucial that we elect leaders who are aware of these issues, but not only aware, they're open to understanding these issues and committed to ensuring that we protect and advance those civil rights. And so stakes are high. The outcome is really going to shape the legal landscape for generations. So
yeah, for sure. Thank you for that. And kind of tying to your last point and just highlighting the importance of constitutional interpretation of the Supreme Court, and just so people can stay aware, you made an intentional decision to not only get your JD, but also your LLM at Georgetown Law. So would you mind sharing how you see the law playing a role in our society, our work, and in our greater understanding of these issues?
So yes, for sure, Maina. That's a great question too. I believe in the power of the law. I really see it as like a tool in our toolbox for creating change and addressing issues, remedying the deep-seated injustices in our society. So the law, in the way that I think about it, serves as like a framework that not only reveals how marginalized identities have systemically been discriminated against, but it also does provide a pathway toward liberation and equity and inclusion. Historically, the law has been like a double-edged sword, right? On one hand, it's used to entrench discrimination and equality, as we see through cases and policies like segregation and disenfranchisement and unjust sentencing practices. On the other hand, it has been such a powerful instrument for advancing civil rights and dismantling oppressive structures and promoting justice and equality. So for me, pursuing a legal education was really about gaining a comprehensive understanding of this duality, or this dual nature of the law, right? My JD provided kind of that foundational knowledge of legal principles and the ways that the law has been used to both oppress and liberate, gave me kind of the tools to be able to analyze and critique the law, and help me to understand some of the complexities and nuances. And the decision to get the LLM was really driven by my desire to deepen my understanding and to really zoom into how national security law shapes who we are, not only here, but globally, and specifically how racism weakens our national security. And so the LLM allowed me to kind of look at the intersections of race and policy and law on a deeper level. I can talk about this all day. I'm not going to do it, but I really think about it as like when you go to the doctor, you have to fill out like the medical history before you can get like your prescription.
Oh.
That's how I see the law, right? Like it is both kind of like a diagnostic, kind of see the history and like how things were created. And then it's that prescription because it can, if we have, the right people in place and the right tools, it can create that meaningful change that we need. So hope that answered it.
No, yeah, I love that. I never thought of it like that before. Are there people that you see as being role models in the legal profession who have provided this inspiration and motivation, or kind of what drove you towards this career path?
Yeah, I think I knew I was going to be a lawyer when I was like 7 years old, and my mom was trying to convince me to wear a dress to church, and I was able to talk my way out of it. She was like, "Okay." So I think I kind of always knew I was going to do something. I didn't necessarily know it would be the law, but there are definitely people who legal trailblazers who are inspiration and motivation for me, like everyone from Constance Baker Motley, who was the first African-American woman appointed to the federal judiciary. Her advocacy around desegregation of higher ed was like amazing, so courageous. Pauli Murray, who was another profound influence for me, their work as a legal scholar and activist was so intersectional and the basis for so many cases around women's rights and civil rights. Thurgood Marshall, of course, first African American on the Supreme Court. Sherilyn Ifill, who was the president and director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. I mean, I can name so many people. Of course, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, right? Have you read her dissents? Like that just in itself is like inspirational and motivational. And I'll just say, like, I think, this work is hard, doing the work of civil rights and human rights, especially in the legal world, it's hard. And so I think, every single attorney and judge who act as unsung heroes in the legal profession, like who work tirelessly in courtrooms and communities across the country, really, really without recognition, like to make sure they protect the right of marginalized people who often don't have the same financial resources. And I mean, their dedication and their courage and perseverance always motivate me as well.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, and kind of shifting now towards your specific role as the counsel and director of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Would you mind sharing with us how you kind of came into this role and the summary of what you do?
For sure. I mean, I started a little bit by telling about the 7-year-old version of me that didn't want to wear that dress to church. But as someone who has intersecting identities as a Black woman, masculine of center, lesbian, happy Pride Month, by the way. My journey to this space is deeply rooted in my personal experiences and professional endeavors. I've always centered equity and inclusion, even before I knew that, these were formal words. I've always wanted to create spaces where people felt they can be their most authentic selves, or they can be safe and courageous, and to learn and grow together. So I've held a variety of positions that all kind of relate to that theme of courage and authenticity and empathy and compassionate advocacy. Everything from class president in high school to Southern Diversity Delegate at my small liberal arts college in Birmingham, Alabama, to working at Teach for America, where I helped to spearhead our diversity training programs for incoming core members and staff, to working in voting rights and really realizing how working as a voting rights attorney and in those spaces are a manifestation of the DEI work. And so all of those things kind of culminated to the space that I'm in now, where I'm responsible for infusing equity and inclusion into our programming at the DNC, working across all levels of the organization, collaborating with various stakeholders to advance our mission of creating more inclusive representation and democracy. And so I've done a little bit of everything from, training sessions for hundreds of folks across the country and developing strategic plans and really just trying to infuse, if we are the party of inclusion, just making sure we infuse that into every facet of our being. So I just see it as a continuation of what I've always kind of done.
And on the topic of inclusion and the importance of diversity in various sectors, in current times, as well as from the standpoint of the last 4 to 5 years following the George Floyd murder and subsequent protests, how does this role, or what does this role really mean to you during this time specifically?
Yeah. So I think the tragic deaths of Black and Brown folks across the country and the powerful waves of protest that followed really drove home the need for systemic change in addressing racial injustice. These events, I mean, I remember that summer it was George Floyd, it was Breonna Taylor, like it was like so many people back to back to back, and I think they really catalyzed a national reckoning with deep-seated inequalities and systemic racism that it's been here for a long time, but there are cameras now and people recording and people seeing this on a mass scale. And so I think in my role I am kind of in the center of the critical work in terms of like infusing equity and inclusion with the people who are touching the people who are creating the policies, right? And I think that is like, an immense responsibility and a credible opportunity to kind of drive some of that meaningful change within the oldest continuing political organization in the country. So as much as I can help develop and implement DEI initiatives that not only reflect our commitment to being the party of inclusion internally, but that really can help influence the broader political landscape. I see it as a blessing, right? The role is to create safe and brave spaces where we talk about race and equity and inclusion and how to make sure that we are shifting from the systemic racism that's kind of plagued our country and create more inclusion.
Yeah, thank you for that. And kind of talking about proximity, we're speaking less than a month before the RNC and
Yes, Mina.
before the DNC, not to stress you out. But but it seemed that there's so much up in the air, the White House, the Senate, House. So as a first question, can you place this election in a historical context and share your thoughts on whether this really is the most important election in our lifetimes?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not stressed. It's fine. We're good. No, so I'll first start off by saying that I really do think we're at a pivotal moment in American history, and one that will, as I spoke about earlier, it will shape our country for generations to come. And I want to like really cement that in the fact that like we've been at pivotal moments as a country before with elections, right? If we think about the election of 1860 with Abraham Lincoln, he became the president and set the stage for the Civil War, eventual abolition of slavery, right? Like that was a pivotal moment in our country. Election of 1932 during the Great Depression, we got Roosevelt's New Deal, which transformed the role of federal government in American life. That was a pivotal moment. We got the election of 1980 with Reagan, which we saw a reduction of government spending on social programs, which led to income inequality. We saw the war on drugs, which significantly increased incarceration rates, especially for Black and Brown folks, right? Like that was a pivotal moment that had generational impact. We saw the election of 2008 where we had the first African-American president, Barack Obama, which, he ushered in a new kind of era of hope and change and economic recovery. And so, I mean, there's always kind of been these pivotal moments that have had lasting impacts. I often think about, Reconstruction and the Civil War where, we got all of these great civil rights legislation passed from the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. to that backlash and rollback of many of those rights through Jim Crow. And so this current election kind of stands in the crux of like these pivotal elections that we've seen historically, this idea of like when we've seen a wave of civil rights legislation being passed and then taken away. This election is right in that, right? Because it has implications on everything from social justice to public health to thinking about really just the very fabric of our democracy. And so it's not about this election. To me, it's not about like choosing a leader. It really is about deciding on which values and principles that's going to guide our nation moving forward. It's about addressing the issues like healthcare and climate change and voting rights. And so, the last thing I'll say is like we've seen backlashes when people who don't center values of justice come into play, and we've seen the implications of those. And so I'll say like, the phrase the most important election in our lifetimes, it may sound dramatic. And I, have had many conversations about this, but I do think it rings true. In our lifetime, while we are alive, I do think that, this is a truly important election. And I really don't think the stakes could be higher for what we'll see in our lifetime.
Mm-hmm. And branching off what you just mentioned about those values and principles, in the conversations that you're having, what are those issues that are kind of coming to the forefront? I know you mentioned just a bunch of them, but what are you seeing that's being most important to like young adults or the younger generation that we're trying to specifically mobilize into voting?
Yeah, I still consider myself a young adult, I think. So I think we do have a unique set of challenges and opportunities, right? And I think there are some core things that are coming up, everything from the economy and the job market, right? Like ensuring that folks have living wages and that kind of hierarchy of needs, to housing affordability, rent, being able to purchase homes. Education and student debt is a really, really big one. Shout out to the Biden-Harris administration for erasing the student loan debts of folks across the country. I think healthcare is a big one, especially as young adults are starting to transition from their parents' healthcare plans into their own plans, wanting to make sure that they have healthcare, racial and social justice still, right? Those are things that folks are fighting for. I think mental health is a really big one. How are we making sure that we're not only providing for people structurally with like the economy and housing, but also mental and emotional as we're navigating this world? And I think the other big one is like political engagement and representation. We're seeing diverse leaders across the board being elected. And I think it's young folks who are driving that, who want to see representation that looks like them, and representation that has their values and best interest at heart.
Yeah, and I wish I could vote in November so badly. But for those of us who can't, what would your advice be on like concrete ways that we can get involved, increase voter turnout, and make an overall positive impact?
Yeah, I think, the folks who can't vote, I actually think are like some of the most important people right now at this juncture in our society. And I think there's so much that can be done. I always go to social media first, just because I think with a real well put together social media campaign plan, there is a way to like make people aware. And I always think that's the first step. It's like, how are we making people aware of voting issues that are arising, aware of candidates and politicians? So that's one. Volunteer. Every single state across the country has a state Democratic Party, every single one. And so reaching out to your state Democratic Party and asking to canvass, to knock on doors, to volunteer, that always opens the door potentially to something else, whether it's like a paid internship or something else. So like reaching out to that local space. And I say get creative. Like it's people, young folks out here are so creative. And so whether that is creating community projects where folks are learning more about the issues and then using that as a way to help with voter turnout, I think that there's always something to do, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that. And there's so much focus, especially right now, on the national races like the White House and Congress. But there are so many, as you mentioned, state and city level races. And in many cases, those are the races and the impacts that we feel most directly. So how can we also stay focused on those local elections while keeping the bigger picture in mind?
Yeah, I think the local elections are so important. It's hard to do because the big elections are the elections that kind of get all of the media frenzy. But there really has to be an interconnected approach because politics are both local and national. The local politics impact everything from your education to transportation to housing to access to food to public safety, and so much more. And so the first thing I would say, to make sure to stay focused on kind of both of those things is, one, find out who your local politicians are, their issues, and attend community events. Like, you got to know who is representing you and what their values are, especially at the local level. And so connecting with your local politicians, whether it's your community commissioner, if you have an ANC commissioner, whoever that local person is, participate in local campaigns. So as I just mentioned, with young folks who can't vote yet, like, volunteer, work with candidates who have your best interest at heart, knock on doors, talk to people. I always think that's the best way to kind of hear what matters to folks the most. Educate and mobilize others. Like, each one teach one. As a former teacher, like, how are we making sure we're teaching to other folks? And vote in every election. Vote in every election, not just the national ones. Like, vote for your local mayor, vote for your sheriff, vote for your local judge. Like, vote in every single election. um, all of these decisions have implications on our day-to-day lives. And so as much as possible, we just have to be rooted in the fact that, like, national elections impact local elections directly impact people, for sure.
Yeah, thank you for that. Um, two more or a couple more questions for the high school people.
Let's go.
So looking back at your career, and are there certain things that you did or you wish you did, or just advice in general that you would give to people kind of interested in going into DEI and inclusion work?
Yeah. I would say to follow your internal compass. I think I've always had, like, these values of compassionate advocacy, of courage, of service, inclusion, equity. And so that's just kind of been a driving force. So I never was like, I know for sure I'm going to law school, or I know for sure I'm going to do this thing. I just made sure to follow that idea of, like, doing my part, to try to make things better for folks across the country. Volunteering and community service, like, really gave me the opportunity to connect with people across lines of difference and really understand different walks of life. All of those things were kind of foundational in shaping, especially my high school years. Like I said, I was, class president and in student government, but I also did theater, and I also did speech and debate, and I hung out with, like, all the people, and I learned so much from different groups of people, which really, I think, helped me understand that, like, diversity is a plus. Like, we are not created to be the same. We are created to be our unique and authentic selves. And I think really cementing those things as values, like, helped in this career trajectory towards wanting to create inclusion on a broader scale, for sure.
Yeah, that's something that I've been thinking a lot about actually, because I'm a rising junior and going off to college and thinking not just about like the colleges and what classes entice you, but like all those groups of people that you're gonna meet and kind of expanding your horizons.
Big,
So sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just saying that's a big part of it,
Yeah,
right? It's a big
yeah.
part.
So last question, kind of ending with education here. You've clearly invested a lot of time and energy into your education. So for those of us in high school and college, can you make a connection between education and future impact and where you are today?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what we were just talking about, Maina. For me, it was all about following, like, my passion, my purpose, my values. Um, these are the elements for me that gave education a meaning and direction. So when it was hard and when I was tired, or when, going to law school as the first person in my family to go to law school and not really knowing how to navigate that, it was like, what is my purpose? What are my values? Why am I here? And that really allowed me to persist and continue on that path. And so I would say that. And I'll say, I always tell people I began my educational journey as a theater major in undergrad, which may seem completely unrelated to my current work in law and in DEI, but theater really taught me like empathy and communication and the power of storytelling. And I think all of those are crucial in advocacy and leadership. And so I say that to say, like, if your passion is art, do your art. And then remember the values and your purpose, and the doors will open. So even after that, like joining Teach for America, which really deepened my commitment to equity and justice, to going to law school and participating in clinics and practical experiences that align with my values. All of it's connected to me. Like, it's connected to my values, to that internal compass, to that passion, to that purpose. And so as someone who is deeply guided by courage and openness, as you were just saying, trying to think about the different people you'll meet when you go to school. Like, to me, education is not just about acquiring knowledge, right? Like, we can learn, we can read books. I do think it's about understanding who you are, what you stand for, how you can contribute to making the world a better place. And I think that's my connection to education and career. Learn what you can, but keep those values, that purpose, and that passion at the core of it. You go far.
I love that. Thank you. I think that's something everyone needs to hear, is follow your passions. It'll take you where you need to go.
For sure.
So thank you for your leadership and taking the time to be with us today. We're incredibly grateful, and I know your life from like now to the election will be insane. So thank you for covering at the time. We really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you so much, Maina. Shout out to you. Shout out to Begins With Us. And until next time.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.